All right, let's talk about the basic proportions of a head. Now, as a reminder, with any proportional studies, these are loose guidelines. There are so many different ways you could approach this, lots of different tips and tricks. So this is just somewhere to get you started. And of course, all heads come in different shapes and sizes, so we're gonna think about this as just a loose template. Now for this exercise, we do need some guidelines, which honestly, you could probably do just by eyeballing them, but if you want, you can use a ruler. So what I'm gonna do is near the top of my page, and in your sketchbook, you should make sure that you're working in this horizontal or landscape format. I'll draw a line, and about 4 inches beneath it, if you are using a ruler, we're gonna draw a bottom line. This will represent the very top of our head and the very bottom of the chin. You can go ahead and also label that if you want, top and bottom. The next thing we want to do is dissect this in half. So of course, again, if we're using a ruler, that we're going to find the 2 spot on either side if you'd like. And we're going to connect that. Remember, these guidelines can be pretty light. They don't need to be there at the end of the drawing. Excuse me. So now we have our halfway point, which you can label in the center. We're going to then cut the halfway point in half to make a quarter. So that will be 1 inch. Okay. So again, as parallel as possible here, I'm going to cut a corner and just do 1 tick mark. Okay. This is our quarter mark. So again, we did 4 inches, then 2 inches, then 1 inch. And then last but not least, we're going to cut this bottom section in half. So this would actually be a 1/2 inch mark, but honestly, I'm just gonna eyeball it because it doesn't have to be perfect. So let's set that up. Okay, not bad. So we have our top and bottom, we cut that in half, half again, and half again. That gives us an 1/8. Okay. So we're gonna start with the frontal view of the head, which loosely is lives in a rectangle that's about 2 by 3 approximately. So if you want to just start visualizing a rectangle that's something similar to this, about 2 parts by 3 part, that'll get you started. Now, as you know, the head is somewhat of an egg shape, but the top and the bottom are not the same, even if you're starting really simple and generalized. Now for that top half of the egg, be sure that you start off pretty vertical, okay? I'm also working kind of light so I can make changes. It doesn't really curve till it gets pretty high up, and even then, the top of the head is pretty flat. So you really want to be careful that your head doesn't do something like this where you have a pointy triangle. Also, I should mention before I forget, we want to make a vertical axis right down the center. So even before you start that, or you can add it right now, go ahead and make a vertical axis. This will help us keep things symmetrical as we develop them on either side. And if you make a bit of a mistake, of course, just use an eraser and make that adjustment. Okay, so we have the top half. Now the bottom half is going to start to create the jaw. And I sort of like to think about 3 lines on each side. So the first line going from our half to quarter line is a very shallow angle. Just comes in a bit from the vertical, but not very much. The next one is significantly steeper, okay? So this one might be closer to, I don't know, a 45-degree angle or something similar. And then the last one is kind of just the flat portion of the chin. So I've got 1, 2, 3. Now notice here already my head is not very symmetrical. There's a small gap here and a wide gap here. So I'm just gonna make a quick adjustment to make that a little bit more even. This is also a good time to just ask yourself, does the head feel like really weirdly wide or kind of weirdly tall? If so, you can make it a little bit, narrower or wider until it feels like, okay, that maybe could be the beginning of a head. All right, now that we have that basic shape started, we can move on to thinking about how we can use these dividing halfway points to sort of plot key features of the face. So the first thing is that our eyes are actually right in the middle of our skull. Now you might think they're higher, but remember, parts of the skull will eventually be covered by hair. So if you were to shave your head, or if you're bald, you'll see that eyes are right in the middle. So when you make some eye shapes, and for now they can just be generic football shapes, put them right on that line, but also consider the width. Now I'm sort of used to doing this, so I can probably get pretty close on my first attempt, but let me show you how I determine this width. the width of a single eye should be about the same as the width of the distance between the eyes. So you can even, some people like to actually draw in a third eye to get a sense of where that's going to be. And similarly, the distance between the outer eye and the side of the face should be a quarter eye. So if you're trying this out, I'm sorry, not a quarter eye, a half of an eye. So if you're trying this out and these aren't fitting, you're going to have to make those adjustments. Keep tweaking them to be, wider or narrower until you have, again, an eye's width in the middle and then a half an eye on either side approximately, okay? Now you can erase these extra parts or just leave them for now. Maybe I'll leave mine in this state. This is fine, okay? Don't worry too much about the shape being realistic at this point. Okay, so next comes the nose. So at the corner mark is typically the bottom of the nose, the very lowest part. Now here's some other tricks for setting up a nose in a frontal view. Typically the widest part of the nose is somewhere near the corners of the eyes. So you can draw little guidelines down. And I like to make sort of just 2 commas. Now these commas might be a little higher because the center ball of the nose will be lower. For that, you can just start with kind of a simple shape like this. Some people like to do the ball approach where you make 3 circles, a big one and then 2 little ones. But however you do it, I wouldn't draw any like vertical lines up here. What we really need are just these sort of 2 comma shapes and then something in the middle that's a little bit lower that rests on the quarter line. Now let's talk about the mouth. Generally speaking, the bottom of the mouth lands on this 8th line, right? So halfway between the bottom of the nose and the chin will be the bottom of our mouth or something close to it. Now when drawing the mouth, like for the bottom lip, there's kind of 3 lines, the bottom lip, the middle, and the top lip. I don't always even draw the full bottom lip, and we're not thinking about details now anyways. So I'm just gonna draw 3 rough lines to get me started, okay? If you wanna kind of shape out how that top line has a bit of a little bit of a, what's that called? Oh my gosh, like a U shape, right? You can do that. If you wanna add, a sense of detail, you can. But really, we're talking about 3 lines, right? Top, middle, and bottom. And the bottom one is sitting nearest that 8th mark. You can make the lips, bigger or smaller depending on the person as well. Now at this point, part of me is wondering if my face is a little bit wide. I could slice it down a bit, but I think we're still in the realms of normal proportions. So I'm gonna keep it for now. You can also do things like round the chin or make it more angular or play with these to get, again, a different type of face. Now one last thing, a way that these measurements can help us. These same half and quarter lines that gave us the eye and the bottom of the nose are also conveniently where our ears are. Let me see if I can erase some of this. I do want to make this a bit more slender. Of course, my eraser is not the best. That's okay. So this will mark the top and bottom of your ears. So, a simple way to have your ear for now is just kind of an organic shape that's wider on the top and narrower on the bottom. Again, we can kind of flush out details later. So sort of a curved shape, something like this, just to kind of mark roughly where those ears are gonna go, okay? Now there are of course other features I haven't added like eyelids or eyebrows. It's up to you if at this point you wanna add them. But honestly, when we're first sketching out a face, this is really about as far as I want to go, okay? We're going to talk about how to refine some of those details later. But if this still feels like, there's a lot of empty space up here, oops, sorry to bump that. Remember, eventually we're going to have a hairline somewhere up here and maybe, some hair that goes above the skull, and that'll start to feel a little bit more natural, okay? All right. Let's move on to our profile view. So we're going to use these same vertical guidelines, but this time we're going to think about how the head changes when you look at it from the side. So one thing I like to do is start off with a circle. Now this circle starts at the top, right? It's important for our proportion that we start at the same spot, and it ends on the quarter line beneath it, okay, where we have the nose from before. So I'm going to do my best to draw a light circle. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I use these light lines and kind of just keep going over it until I find, my favorite of the group of lines. Just something to get me started, landing on that quarter line, okay? Now the next thing I'm gonna do is draw just sort of a loose, slightly curved line that represents kind of where the face will be. And notice that it curves back a bit. So it sort of starts on the outer edge of my circle, and then it curves back. So the bottom part's going to be a little bit further inwards towards the neck than the top. After that, I can add a jawline, which again, this is actually mirroring what happened here. We'll kind of cut back to that 8th line. So something like this to get me started. Now you can start either kind of with the ear and get that figured out, or you can start with the face, it's up to you. But let's talk about the ear first today. So the ear kind of exists very close to the central axis. So I might even draw this in now, doing my best to make sure it's in the center of the circle I just created. And this sort of intersection, which is again the halfway point vertically and also the halfway point horizontally, is a great indicator of kind of where the ear may start. It might be a little bit further back, but honestly, it's something similar to that, okay? Again, I'm gonna draw an angled shape. The ear always angles forwards towards the jaw. But that top left corner of the ear usually is pretty close to this. So it's kind of like snug right in between these two guidelines here. If you wanted to finish the jaw, you could also bring that up as well, okay? Let's move on to the face. So remember, this is not the actual, of course, shape of the face. We need to make all these protrusions and indentations for things like the nose, the lips, the eyes, okay? So the first thing I want to think about is making this notch that happens on your skull right as we get into those ocular cavities. So on that halfway spot, before we draw the eye, go ahead and have a little bit of an indentation. So notice how this kind of cuts in from that circle. And behind that is going to be where the eye is. Now we know vertically that the eye is on this halfway point, but what about the shape and placement? Well, an eye in profile is a lot like a triangle. So if I start with just kind of a 2 lines of a triangle, 1 and 2, that are pretty long with a shallow angle, the 3rd line, instead of making it straight, we're going to curve it just a bit, okay? Now remember, the eyeball is actually a full sphere behind this, but we only see a little bit, which is still curved. And those top and bottom lines of your triangle may extend past the curvature a little bit. Be sure that you're not super close to this ridge bump either. If it's really, really close with no space, you might need to move it back a bit. Next, let's talk about that nose. Now there's a huge variety of nose shapes. I think out of all the shapes, the nose maybe has the most variety, okay? But after you have that notch, you can kind of start to play with a nose shape. You can start with just 2 simple lines. So obviously one that's long and steep, and then a shallow one here as well. But remember, the back of the nose is gonna kind of hang somewhere underneath where your eye is. So that little comma shape may be back pretty far. You can make your nose, smaller or bigger. You can kind of round it out a little bit, but something like this is just a great place to get started. Again, the lowest part is on that quarter line. Now the lips actually protrude out a bit. So what I'm gonna do is kind of, again, think about those 3 parts. There's the top lip, which might be a bit of a curve. There's that middle line, which, you can have your person smiling or frowning, it's up to you. And then there's the bottom part portion, which is the lower lip, okay? Now that's usually bigger than the upper lip. And it's gonna kind of seamlessly blend into what's about to become the chin. Now when I get to the chin, you just wanna make some sort of small bump. Again, this is where the specifics of individual people really come into play, okay? And I may make a few adjustments to this as well. Maybe move my ear back just a little bit, okay? All right, so, not perfect, but this is a good starting point. And these are the kinds of really basic measurements you wanna think about when you're starting. Now, last thing about, I wanna talk about our necks. When looking at a neck from the front view, you can loosely think about the outer edges of the eye. That's a good place to start your neck. Keep in mind, necks, they stay vertical for a little bit, but pretty quickly, they will start to taper out. So even in these sketches, that's something that you might want to start thinking about, that little bit of a taper there. Now a neck in profile angles back, okay? Your spine is inside there, and actually, we'll talk about this when we get to the whole body, but your neck will actually be angling back. Do not have your necklines vertical. So for the back one, you know, somewhere, I don't know, under the half line, you can kind of start to angle that one back. And somewhere near the front, you can pull away from that chin and angle this one back as well. So they're loosely parallel to each other, okay? Now again, it's gonna seem a little strange because you're gonna have all of this head, okay? But that's okay. You know, again, same thing as last time. Eventually there will be a hairline and hair, which we'll be adding on at a later point, okay? This is a good place to stop. Hopefully this was helpful, and we'll talk about the body next.